Hey guys, the Wolf Den here, and today we'll be taking a look at the much anticipated return of the plastic dwarf cannon and organ gun set for games of Warhammer the Old World, Warhammer Fantasy, as well as early edition games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. We'll be covering the lore of these powerful Dwarfen-built war machines in the various Warhammer settings that they've appeared in, primarily in the Old World as well as in the Age of Sigmar. Then we'll be briefly discussing the various incarnations of these models throughout Warhammer's long history, before taking a look at the box itself and the contents, as well as my overall thoughts on the model itself. Without further ado, let's get into it. The Engineers Guild, they call themselves, Durgrim Rednade snorted. Messing about with black powder and whatnots is what I call it. Still, them engineers can cast a good cannon, and they know how they work like no one else. You want to land a shot on a goblin a mile away? Ask an engineer to lay the gun for you, and they'll ask you which eye you want to hit. Durgrim Redmane. In both the Old World and the Mortal Realms, perhaps the finest creation of dwarfen ingenuity is arguably the numerous types of cannon and artillery pieces produced by dwarven hands. There have been many numerous variations of these devices in both the Old World and in the Mortal Realms. However, the two we'll be focusing on today is the dwarf cannon and the dwarf organ gun. The powerful dwarf cannon in its many forms is considered to be the most reliable, well-built, and accurate artillery piece throughout the Old World and beyond. These cannons are famed for their ability to pinpoint and hit their targets at range, with an almost uncanny accuracy. First created many hundreds of years ago in the world that was, dwarf cannons have their origins in being produced by the dwarf engineers of Karak Zufbar. The first of many sub-patterns and variations of cannon, the most common is the tried and true standard dwarf cannon. Standard in the sense that each artillery piece is a work of art wrought by their dwarven creators, if such a standard thing could even be made, as each cannon is a work of art in their own right. Smaller in stature to the great cannons and artillery pieces produced by the Empire of Man, the dwarf cannon is nevertheless a masterpiece of engineering, due to the quality of their construction and maintenance, as well as the materials used to create the cannon. Many of these artillery pieces are ancient machines, revered by their crews and treated with respect as being almost a member of the artillery team itself. Dwarf cannons function as primarily as ranged artillery pieces, capable of sowing destruction upon many an enemy monster, ranked formation of infantry, and defensive positions with ease. Employed by dwarf artillery crews of usually up to 3 members, and tended to by dwarf engineers when precision shots are required, many a charging Skaven monstrosity and Org-Wa have been shattered by the sustained shelling of dwarf cannons. Ever versatile, these war machines can fire a variety of powerful ammunition types based on the situation at hand. These artillery types include the dreaded chain shot, which functions as 2 cannonballs bound together by dwarven chain, which is fired with devastating effect. Originally made for destroying the masts of enemy sea vessels, the chain shot is devastating against rank-and-file infantry on land. Grape shot. The classic grape shot uses nails, coins, and other materials along with proper shot to fire at the enemy, leading to devastation among infantry. Half charge. Employed by dwarf crews, a half-charge shot is when hitting a target is critical, and the cannon misfiring would be even more disastrous than usual. These shots, combined with the standard artillery shells, make the dwarf cannon a fearsome opponent on many battlefields. Combined with the precision accuracy of their dwarven crews, these numerous types of shell wreak devastation among the various enemies of the dwarven mountain holds. The other most famous member of the dwarf artillery family tree is the venerable organ gun. These strange-looking machines, named because they resemble the musical instrument in which they are named, work by firing smaller shot in a barrage at the same time against a given target. This, of course, makes it lack the range and the killing power of its larger cannon cousins. However, the organ gun has proven its worth on countless battlefields. When properly maintained and cared for by its dwarven crews, organ guns have been known, with all the barrels loaded with an entire salvo fired, to destroy entire enemy units in a single successful volley. Often scoffed at by other engineers of the dwarven holds for its strange design and firing patterns, the organ gun soon proved its worth, and the design was copied and reproduced throughout the dwarven realms. Both the dwarf cannon and the dwarf organ gun have found their place in the fights against chaos, death, and disorder throughout the mortal realms during the Age of Sigmar. A creation of the famed Iron-Weld Arsenal, a combined effort of human, dwarf, and elven engineers to empower the fledgling cities of Sigmar with war machines and technology to fight their wars and battles, the cannon and organ gun have once again rose to prominence in fortification and emplacements throughout the mortal realms. Inspired by their dwarven ancestors, the engineers and cogsmiths of the Iron-Weld Arsenal have recreated the venerable dwarf cannon and organ gun to take to the fields once more. Strongly constructed by precious and valuable materials and overseen by cogsmiths of both human and dwarven nature, the creation of these cannons embodied the skill and pride of their makers as they sow destruction among the enemies of the free cities. Functioning much as they had previously within the old world, with explosive shot or rapid-fire volley, the cannons and organ guns reap a terrible toll on those who would seek to harm those who reside within the free cities of Sigmar, wherever they may settle. Much like the dwarf model line itself, produced by Games Workshop, the dwarf cannon and the dwarf organ gun have seen numerous variations and patterns over the years. The first dwarf cannon, according to the records provided by the Stuff of Legends, first appeared in 1983. Released in lead and including a metal dwarf crew, as well as a plastic tray, also double as a scenic display base, this first cannon was rather impressive for the time, resembling a historical cannon rather than one purely from a fantasy setting. The next release of the dwarf cannons would appear later when Warhammer Fantasy had become much more solid and defined as a game as well as a world itself, primarily during the late 80s and the early 90s. Various metal incarnations of the dwarf cannon, including the dwarf field bombard and the dwarf siege bombard, would make their appearances here. These would also be supplemented by various incarnations of both the dwarf cannon, the newly introduced for the time dwarf organ gun, which would see several variants released throughout the 90s and the early 2000s as various metal and plastic hybrid kits. In 2006, the dwarf cannon and organ gun would see several new all-plastic iterations. The first would be the multi-part plastic kit released in the early half of 2006. This set features a single cannon as well as a plastic organ gun, which was crewed by 3 plastic dwarves whose parts could be mixed and matched with the rest range that existed at the time. The kit could also be built as an organ gun or a cannon, and contained numerous diorama and gun emplacement accessories, and featured an opening and closing breech block as well as shells which could fit inside the cannon itself. Additionally, later that year in the Battle of Skull Pass box set, the dwarf cannon would receive a second, smaller incarnation alongside 3 monopose plastic dwarf crew in the dwarf army half of the box. While smaller and simpler than the plastic cannon and organ gun kit, it nevertheless was quite iconic and is still seen today in many dwarf armies. The plastic kit version of the cannon and organ gun that was released in 2006 would remain in production before being removed from the web store with the cessation of production of Warhammer Fantasy. However, the cannon itself would see a brief resurgence under the dwarf-aligned models of the Cities of Sigmar subfaction, where it would see rules now and again before being removed from the line once again. Finally, in 2024, the cannon and organ gun would once again be released in their plastic glory to accompany the release of the Dwarf Mountain Holds faction for Warhammer the Old World, which was the rebranded and reborn Warhammer Fantasy. And this is the kit that we'll be taking a look at today. So here we have the newest rendition of the plastic dwarf cannon and organ gun set for games of Warhammer the Old World, Fantasy, and games of Age of Sigmar. And I have to say, I love the snowy diorama box art that they chose to do with these models here. It's simpler than most Games Workshop dioramas for their boxes, but something about it really captures the imagination a bit. I do also like the classic illustration of the dwarf cannon and gunnery crews used on the side of the box. So as the title suggests, you get 2 sets of the original kit, which is essentially 1 chassis per kit, which you get 2 of, and 6 crew, along with 4 choices of gun. Flipping the box around, we get another rather simple photo of the 6 crew, and 1 cannon and 1 organ gun. It does show a little look at the extra bits and pieces that you get in this kit. I do like the spyglass and the extra shells for the cannon, as well as the cannonballs for the organ gun. At the bottom, there is also a brief summary painting guide on how to paint the basic dwarf color scheme for those who need it. There's not much to talk about here since this kit, in essence, is rather simple. You get 2 chassis, as well as 4 choices of gun, 2 cannons and 2 organ guns, as well as the crew, and that's pretty much it. What you see on the box is essentially what you get. So first up, we have the instructions for the cannon and the organ gun, as well as the crew. Pretty basic stuff here. There are no parts numbers for either the sprues or the instructions, so everything is done visually. These instructions they're okay. They're not super helpful given that this kit can be a bit complex in a few spots, mainly in the small detail parts as well as the orientation on some of the parts like the foot stand on the back of the gun, but they do the job decently well for what they are and when these were printed. They explain how to put the guns together as well as the accessories, and finally the crew with their various choices of arms and accessories as well. For sprue number 1, we have this large sprue featuring both the cannon and the organ gun parts for each gun, as well as the bits for the chassis and some accessories. The sprues aren't bent, which I've talked about in several previous reviews of Games Workshop kits, and the parts themselves are rather nicely detailed despite their age. There's no warping as far as I can tell, and the plastic is actually pretty nice in quality and feels chunky and solid, like old Games Workshop models, compared to modern Games Workshop plastic sprues, which can be rather thin and spindly. This sprue is of course repeated twice since there are 4 cannon options per box. And here we have the crew and the accessory sprue. I will say that you get a lot of options for the crew. You have engineering masks, ramrods, hands with powder barrels, clipboards, tongs, and numerous other accessories and tools to really customize your dwarf crew. There's enough parts to make each model unique as far as I can tell, and I don't believe you have to repeat options in the same exact order for the crew to make them all different. These bits are definitely useful for kit bashing as well. For example, making your own engineers or cocksmiths or other characters for your various dwarf armies. Again, this sprue is repeated twice for a total of 6 crew, 3 for both cannons. And finally, we have 6 small standard square bases for games of Warhammer Fantasy and the Old World, as well as 2 large square bases, 1 for each cannon. Now that we've gone through all the contents of the box, let's take a look at the finished models, as well as some size comparisons and my overall thoughts on the models themselves once they're completed. So here we have the completed models of both the dwarf cannon and the dwarf organ gun. Starting first with the cannon, my first impression after having owned the Skull Pass dwarf cannon for a long time as this kit was out of print, I expected the kit version of this model to be decently larger, while in reality it's actually not that bigger than the old starter set version. That being said, the model itself is nicely detailed. Taking a closer look, as well as a 360-degree view of the model, you can see how the wood areas of the carriage are ornately carved like a work of art. I like the dragon iconography on what appears to be the ignition hammer on the side of the build as well as the overall detailing on the model itself. So overall, the model is very decently sized, if not a bit small, but given that this is a dwarf cannon, this isn't entirely unexpected. An interesting thing to note is that the cannon itself actually has a small bit of articulation and functionality. The model features some tiny hinges and pegs that if you leave unglued, it allows you to open and close the breech block. Sort of how the Imperial Guard Basilisk model operates, in which the chamber itself can be opened, and the shells from the accessory sprue can be loaded inside. And then the breech block closed again. The shell can actually go all the way through the barrel of the gun and exit out of the other side, though this takes a bit of working to get it all the way through, which honestly has a lot of potential for dioramas of a shell exiting the barrel after it's been fired. Next, we have the organ gun. Doing a 360-degree view of the organ gun here allows the details to be seen. It uses the same carriage as the cannon, just with some different connecting pegs. However, both the cannons fit well into the chassis, so this isn't a problem with either gun being too large or too small. The organ gun is just, if not more, detailed than the cannon itself. It features runes on the barrels, as well as small dragon-faced ignition hammers on each one of the barrels themselves. Other than that, there really isn't too much to say, since the organ gun assembly is a bit simpler than the cannon in terms of assembly. The dragon heads are a bit fiddly to get to sit right, which is why mine looks a bit strange, and I'll probably have to end up redoing these to get them to sit straight. One thing to note is I did actually magnetize my dwarf cannons and organ gun, a video of which will be found on the channel as well, for those who are looking to magnetize their own to get the most out of this box. So you could swap to each gun, the tutorial of which will again be posted on the channel. Now on to the crew. The crew is entirely modular, with most of the 28mm scale plastic dwarves released by Games Workshop. So if you want to kit, bash, or customize them into characters like cogsmiths, Ironweld Arsenal engineers for Cities of Sigmar, dwarf engineers, or anything else that you have in mind, this kit offers a ton of great parts for that purpose. It gives you the parts to build 6 full crew, but easily gives you the arms and extra parts for probably another 3 models at the very least. However, you will need to provide additional bodies. I really like that the engineer's mask that you get, this piece here, is actually an extra part, so you can reuse them on other models if you want to, which I think is nice, and honestly the crew would be perfect for dioramas or display pieces. So now we have a few brief size comparisons of both the dwarf cannon and the dwarf organ gun. The first is the dwarf skull pass cannon previously mentioned, compared to both the dwarf cannon as well as the organ gun, which, as you can see, there really isn't that big of a size difference between these models as I would have previously thought, which is surprising to me once I had finished the kit itself. Next, we have a quick comparison between one of the skull pass musicians, I believe this is the musician for the Thunderers, compared to the dwarf cannon and organ gun, as well as the dwarf crew themselves, which, as you can see, despite being monopose, the plastic miniatures from the Skull Pass box set scale perfectly with the miniatures released here. Now we have a quick look at the cannon and organ gun compared to one of the older plastic Terminators for games of Warhammer 40k. And finally, we have a comparison between the dwarf cannons and organ guns compared to the Bretonnian Pegasus Knights, which were also re-released for games of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer the Old World, which will also be reviewed and looked at on this channel. So now that we've gone over both kits as well as the size comparisons, I'd like to sum up my overall thoughts with putting this kit together. For the build category, I give the dwarf cannon and organ gun a 3.5 out of 5. The build itself isn't very complicated, and by that extent, it's not super interesting either. Each gun is less than 20 pieces, and for the most part, they go together okay. However, what stumped me was that I couldn't figure out how to get the cannon supports on the carriage to line up properly to allow enough space for the footstool for the crew to step on in the back of the gun. I wasn't able to get it to fit normally despite following the instructions perfectly, and I had to sand both parts significantly on both the carriages to get them to fit, leading for them to look rather strange. Of course, this could have been my mistake, but as far as I can tell, I was following the instructions exactly how they were presented, and it was rather frustrating to get them to go together, at least for this part. When finished, the dwarf cannon and organ gun both look really nice, and so for that, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 in the looks category. They look really nice, but no outside modification needed in order to make these models look great. Each model for both the cannon and the organ guns have their own personalities and details, and even have a few working features here and there. as well as the crew looking great and offering a wide variety of parts to really customize them, as well as to get plenty of extra bits to go into your bits box or to use on other models. Pretty much what you see here is what you get. The material quality category for the Dwarf Cannon and Organ Gun gets a solid 4 out of 5. The kit quality here is pretty good. I've talked about Games Workshop's plastics before, so you've probably heard what I've said, but they're generally pretty good outside of a few exceptions. For these models, they feel really nice, solid and chunky and good to handle. I didn't feel like I was going to break anything just by snipping them out of the runners themselves, which is good. However, I did notice that there was a bit of warping on the leg parts of the carriage, which was a pain because it wouldn't let me assemble the footrest properly. However, again, this might have been simply my error, and besides that, the kit here is very accommodating and easily goes together, especially due to the solid material. Even to magnetizing it, which wasn't really intended to do right out of the box, which I also had no problems with creating the holes for the magnets in which I used to magnetize it. Accessories and decals, 4.5 out of 5. There's tons of accessories for both the cannon and organ gun as well as the crew. There's standalone shells, cannonballs, tons of equipment and gear for the crew, powder barrels, ramrods, and more, which really let you get personal with how you want to make the gun crew look, with tons of options to really mix and match across the dwarf line to make your own characters, or to simply make it so you can spice up how your crew look without having to repeat models, which is great. I love the powder barrel hefted over the shoulder as well as the clipboard. They have a lot of personality to them. There's no decals in this kit, however it offers plenty of runes, dwarven charms, and tons of other bits and pieces in physical form, which more than make up for the lack of decals in this kit. I always appreciate when models of this size, or Games Workshop models in general, offer plastic or hard transfers instead of relying purely on decals. Instructions. And finally, for the instructions category, this kit gets a 3.5 out of 5 from me. These parts are not really hard to put together, and they would take less than an hour to straight build both the cannons and the crew, even with glue drying time and cleaning all of the parts factored in. That being said, an alternate angle view of the cannon from above would have been really helpful in order to see how the cannon actually goes together. As previously mentioned, I had trouble with the rear portion of the gun itself. But clearly this is just the original 2006 instructions, reprinted once again and slightly magnified. So would I recommend the Dwarf Cannon and Organ Gun kits for games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, the Old World, and Fantasy? Yeah, I would. It's a solid, fun model that has a lot of character and personality despite its age. However, I would recommend that if you can get a discount on this model, I would certainly recommend it, or simply picking up secondhand versions of this model. Now that the kit is re-released, I've noticed that the secondhand original releases of the model have gone down in price. The fact that you get two of what previously for the price of one that was originally listed is rather nice, and it offers twice the bits to be used in other projects, as well as having more artillery for your dwarf army. Outside of the warped plastic for the rears of the guns, the builds are pretty fun and straightforward. They're not tricky or hard in any way. As long as you follow the instructions, they're pretty straightforward builds. It is also rather easy to magnetize the cannon and the organ gun to each chassis to be able to swap the models out depending on what kind of artillery you need. So I would definitely grab these models if you're looking for some alternate iron weld arsenal cannons for your Age of Sigmar army, or regular artillery for games of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer the Old World. So if you're looking for some rather solid dwarf models to add to your artillery line, or to add to your dwarf collection in general, I'd highly recommend picking these models up if you have the chance.